Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this edition of TEL Researchers and HE Researchers. I'm going to be hosting today. My name's John Brindle. I am Learning Design Manager at Edge Hill University, and I am currently paused, actually, but a PhD student at Lancaster University as well, where I'm studying at thesis stage and writing a thesis on inclusive practice. I'm going to let Puyin introduce herself as well.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. So I'm Puyin. I am one of the heads of digital education at the University of Birmingham, and I'm also on the same program as the PhD program as John. I'm currently not paused because if I pause, I will never return. So hopefully I'll finish my PhD within about a year. That's what I said this time last year. So we shall see. Good to see everyone today.
So it's my absolute privilege to introduce Simon Thomson to you today, who's going to be speaking for us. Simon is currently Professor of Hybrid Learning and Director for Flexible Learning at the University of Manchester, where he's currently working on the university's strategic approach to blended and flexible learning. Simon was also previously, before that, was my boss at the University of Liverpool. So I've worked with Simon, which has been was fantastic. So Simon was once referred to as one of those flipped academics, based on a Guardian article which talked about an emerging group of academics who inform first and publish later. It's a label he's happy to wear, having always prioritised enhancing the student experience over and above any subject-based research profile, and considers himself more of a TEL scholar rather than a TEL researcher. A passionate supporter of open education, his work and research now largely focuses on hybrid or mixed modal education, from which has emerged the subject, pedagogy and modality, or SPAM framework. It's the only good kind of SPAM, I think, going at the moment. All of which is available to access openly and for free under a Creative Commons license, which will all form part of his talk, examining the role of scholarship in the context of the research practice nexus in higher education. That was a real mouthful, that, Simon, but it's all good.
I thought you were going to summarise it, because now basically I don't need to do my talk.
Oh, no, we're looking forward to hearing it come from you as well, Simon. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Simon.
Thank you. Before I share slides, I think, just to recognise the work that John and Puyin put into these talks. It's not easy generating interest and a community around this, so I'm very grateful. And I've also been on the programme that you've been on, and I also paused mine a number of times, so do not be worried about pausing it, because it's absolutely part of the journey. So, and I will touch on that a little bit. The most important question of the day is this first one, which is, which photo do you prefer? And that is because I prefer the black and white one. And I sent that in to Puyin and said, please use this one. And she said, no, it must be colour this year, because I'm not using black and white ones, I'm using colour. So let's test Mentimeter out with the first question of the session, which is, which photo do you prefer? So yeah, you had a choice, black and white one or colour one. Please vote black and white. Not that I'm trying to bias. Oh no, please don't let it be colour. Oh, I've done that on purpose. Come on. Anyway, I'm just going to skip this slide in a minute, if it doesn't go up to... Anyway, so I think it's quite interesting how we have these perceptions of ourselves, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and how we represent ourselves visually as well can be quite a nerving thing. And I kind of feel a little bit of a fraud here in this kind of opportunity, I guess, and I'll probably talk a little bit about that in a second. But we've tested Mentimeter with the most important questions, so even if you don't ask any more questions this afternoon, then we've done the important one. So there is another question. The next question is this one. How often does higher education feel a bit alien to you? While you're all filling that in, at all stages of my career, there's been an element of higher education in its broadest term that's felt a bit alien to me. And when you talk to people, some people exude this confidence that higher education is just the most natural place for them to be. And then some people just tell cautionary tales about experiences. but I think it's a question that I ask myself quite often. So just how do you vote? If you go to menti.com, sorry, I should have explained the instructions. That's very presumptuous of me. And then type in the code 22018883, then you will be able to vote. But I think it's a strange place, higher education. One, because it has very kind of cliquey communities that you can never break or get into, but it's also got a sense of community that you absolutely feel part of. And there's always that kind of, you're always living those experiences. So occasionally, I'm much more of occasionally into often. So even now, I often feel it's not the place that I'm naturally meant to be. And I often wonder how I arrived here, I guess. But we'll look at that as I go through my little journey, I guess, with you. So this is my make use of Copilot, which I have a license for at our institution, to create some images to plop into PowerPoint. There we go. So the first thing I'll talk about really is higher education is an alien space for me, and not a space that I naturally would ever set out to be in. I think that's the main thing. So the other question that I think always interests me is, are you first in family? Are you the first in your family to go to higher education? That for me is an interesting question. And obviously, as more and more people come into higher education, there'll be less and less people that say this. But I was the first in my family, in my entire family. Actually, none of my cousins had gone before me. So in my extended family, I was the very first person to go to university. So it was never something that we talked about, really. I just found myself in a group of friends, I think, that were talking about university. So I think that it's interesting. If you are first in family to go to university, there's an additional element of this isn't the right place for me, because people haven't talked about it, not talked about the experience, the expectation, and so on. So the other question then, I think, is, are you an only immediate family HE learner? Because you might be first, but are you still the only one? And I am still the only member of my immediate family that has gone to university. So either put yes or put no, because my parent or guardian's been, or my siblings been. And that for me is something that I recognise in my experience, because if you don't have a family or you don't have a group of people where you're talking about university, then it does feel like a space that you don't naturally understand, or you don't naturally belong. And I suppose what I'm doing here for you is setting the scene, I guess, a bit for my journey. My first memory really of learning is actually really quite odd, I think. And it was that my mum used to clean for this big company in the town that we lived. And what she used to do is she used to pick me up from school. And we're talking like primary school. We used to pick me up from school. We used to go to the offices to clean. She used to put me in the boardroom, and I used to do my homework at the boardroom table. And that is where it's really weird how that memory sticks with me. And I think it sticks with me because I recognise that my family was not thinking about education as a thing that my mum and dad really did. My dad was a white collar worker. He worked for British Leyland, in factories and things. He did do well in that because he became a manager of an area, but it was never steady an aspirational thing that we talked about. And I think that's always something that I recognise. And sometimes I see that in my own students, and that's something that's really plays on my mind, that the route into higher education can very much determine how you feel about it when you arrive. Saying that, though, I was always interested in problem solving and understanding things. I wouldn't say academically, I would say much more kind of practically, but still I had this natural thing where I was investigating things, pulling things apart and really trying to solve problems. And I think that plays to my work. So without going back too far, in the mid-90s, I guess I started my first career, which was in broadcast video production. I did a degree in theatre and media and music. and eventually headed down a path that was media related. And I spent a number of years just doing video production stuff. And then I suppose a few years down the line, and I found my second career, which was starting to teach media or broadcast related stuff in an FE college. And I actually really value that experience because it taught me the craft of teaching. Or actually, it taught me the craft of engagement or engaging with learners, because if you've ever taught in FE, you often, unfortunately, in my experience, end up with those learners that were told they weren't good enough for A-levels. So you often end up with people that the school, in the case that I was, didn't want because they weren't going to achieve A-levels and they didn't want to keep them in the sixth form system. So you often ended up with disenfranchised learners, learners that didn't have a real drive, and sometimes those that just ended up on the programme because they didn't have anywhere else to go. So I spent a huge amount of my time learning how to craft teaching that was engaging. And I think that did me really well when I moved into higher education. In 2001 then, so like 90s, early 2000s, I managed to bag a job as a lecturer in higher education. That was then Leeds Metropolitan University. And I don't know how I did that. I honestly do not understand how I managed to get that job, other than just being enthusiastic about teaching. And they were probably looking for somebody that was very teaching focused. But obviously, I grabbed that opportunity with both hands because I felt as if this was a turning point, but it was also my first experience of higher education other than my own degree experience, because I did a degree, I went into video production, I didn't do a postgrad, and then I ended up in higher education. Now, as part of that, obviously, then they go, you really ought to do a postgrad. So I did end up doing one of those in the end, but it wasn't a natural career. This wasn't something that I had designed to do. It was just something that ended up happening, and I wasn't quite sure how I arrived there. But I think that move into higher education was a point at which, and you'll notice in my slide at the beginning, I crossed out TAL researcher and I put TAL scholar. And I said to Puyin, oh, can we just she says, I'm not rebranding the TAL researcher sessions just for you, but I still don't see myself as a researcher, I guess. I see myself as a scholar, and that's something we'll pick up in a minute. But I think when I moved into higher education, I felt that's the point at which I became a scholar, because you didn't say you didn't like it, but you definitely wouldn't change it. I think becoming a scholar is an interesting transition itself, from being just really focused on teaching as a craft. I'm not saying you don't do scholarship with that, but then you definitely become more scholarly, I think, in a higher education environment for a host of reasons. And one of the things that I think I really enjoyed about scholarship was this idea of the science and the art of teaching coming together, because I believe there's two sides. There is a science component to it. You might call that pedagogical understanding, I guess. But there is also an art. There's a craft. There's a human capacity to it that you might not be able to describe very coherently. And I love that idea that it's so nuanced, teaching, that it depends on the learners you've got, the teaching you've got, the space that you're in, the day of the week, the time of the day, the weather. All those things go into influencing what teaching is. And I really kind of find that quite interesting. So that shift to HE was when I suppose, became more scholarly, I guess. And then as I was progressing through that, I guess then my career 3 began, which was the science and art of teaching, but using technology. So I really became interested in, I suppose, merging together my understanding of technology, particularly a video audio type technology, and how we utilize that for teaching, and how that then translates into scholarship. So on the previous slide was like loads and loads of threads of cotton, indicating loads of different learners. And then this is a sewing machine, which I suppose is a way of directing learning through a particular technology in order to create something brilliant at the end of it. And I like that idea of using technology to broaden access, but also to direct learning and to help support learning as an activity. So that is my career 3, really, was when I started to really bring together the art and science of teaching and the capabilities afforded to us through the use of technology. Being somebody that's interested in using AI generated content, if you just throw a question into Copilot and say, what does it mean to be a scholar? This is the kind of thing that it blurts out. I wouldn't say I would argue against much of that, other than it then says, but you must be engaged in scholarly pursuits, which doesn't help if you don't understand what scholar is. But largely, I think it's right that it is a person who has studied a subject in great deal and possesses profound knowledge and is actively engaged in scholarly pursuits, often in an academic setting. And you could say, well, a researcher does that, but this is where I'm going to come on to this video.
The difference between research and scholarship are probably the nature of the way you go about it. Scholarship is something that I consider scholarly. You are scholarly because you're more generally interested. Research is actually a practice. Research is where you actually set out, you have a hypothesis, you set out a series of objectives, and you undertake a body of research. Now, that body of research can be as simple as, what car do I want to go and buy? And you actually undertake an exercise where you you collect a series of data, you evaluate, and you come up with a conclusion. To, as something as complex as how to find a cure for cancer. So you undertake evidence-based research. And many people say, well, the difference between scientific method and method in the humanities, people don't understand. But even in the humanities, you have to actually go about evidence-based, and you have to formulate an hypothesis, and you have to test that hypothesis. It's just that it has a different set of parameters into how you draw that information in. So that's active research. Whereas scholarship is more about the acquisition of knowledge and the way that you utilise that knowledge in a scholarly way, scholarly manner. So a true scholar is interested in many different aspects other than just their immediate narrow element of their discipline.
So I'll move us on there, but then you can get the idea of that. So I'm interested in your thoughts around that. So to what extent do you agree with the statement? You should be able to slide it across, although it says my network's unstable, but we'll see what happens there. So the idea is that you get to either choose strongly disagree or strongly agree against each of those. What you were saying was this idea that researchers are about generating new knowledge and scholars are about drawing upon and having a deep understanding of existing knowledge. And that is from 2012, and that was one of the first things that I came across to help me understand how we might differentiate between research and scholarship. And that's not to say that I don't do research, and we'll come on to that in a minute, but I think I feel more comfortable as a scholar, if that makes sense. So you can see here, we've got a middle-y kind of view, I guess, of what people perceive, in this that we probably don't have a consensus in this group around that terminology. And I think that can be challenging for us, but it's like anything in higher education, you never get a consensus on any single term. But it's useful for us, I think, to have a frame of reference, and that is my frame of reference. So what we've got here is this, that is basically indicating that we've got a 3.1%, 3.1 out of 5 average acceptance that term is what everybody in this room thinks. And the bottom one is, in job role terms, it's easy to differentiate between a researcher and a scholar, and we're less certain about that. We agree less with that idea. And I think that's true. It's difficult to kind of separate those roles or those activities apart. Yet we try and do it. But in my kind of my experience and my career, I suppose where I've existed, many of us would exist in probably three broad domains as academics, particularly a teaching, research and scholarship domain. And even when I wasn't an academic and I didn't have any requirements to do research, I was probably doing research. I was never fully away from it. You're always on the periphery of it. And if you don't have a teaching role, you are probably in some way supporting teaching or you're supporting scholarship. So I think all three of those domains touch on a lot of the work we do in higher education. And some of you will be much deeper into some domains as some others. Yeah, so that kind of third space is an interesting space to be, and you will still gravitate slightly towards one of the domains. We'll come back to this towards the end. So I guess what happened then is I was really starting to think about the relationship between technology and learning and teaching. I was starting to do some things that others would think were innovative and I just thought were great ideas. And I think that's another thing is somebody go, oh, that's really innovative. And in my head, I'm going, well, it just seemed like a good idea. It didn't feel innovative to me. And that innovation is a word that I've always struggled with. And again, I think there's a continuum there. But what I did in 2006 was I'd observed in my own teaching that after about week 2, because I'd prepared my slides and gave them to students and did recordings of my lectures, they decided they didn't need to come to my lectures anymore. And to be honest, they were probably right, because I probably designed lectures in a way that I wouldn't design them now, most definitely. But also, I probably designed them for information because I knew they would need that information later on to help revise from. I think that's a challenge that we all have. But what I decided to do instead was to basically just run the first 2 weeks of my lecture, of my 14-week program, the first 2 weeks as lectures, and the last 2 weeks would also be lectures. Everything else in between I delivered as a podcast. And believe you me, trying to do a podcast in 2006 is not as easy as doing a podcast in 2024-25, because as it was technically viable, but you couldn't just open up a laptop and go into a podcast platform and record it and it would do all this lovely stuff for you. You literally had to record the audio, find somewhere to put it that students could listen to it, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not going to go through the page, but that for me was one of the most transformative things that I did in my teaching. So my line manager at the time told me I couldn't do that. So this is a cautionary tale, but I did check and I wasn't contractually obliged to do lectures. I was contractually obliged to teach learners and give those learners good outcomes and experiences. So even though my line manager didn't like it, I did do it. And that's a risk. Sometimes we feel as if we have to take risk. And I did take a risk. The students loved it. And so generally did the programme and other people around me. And that was recognised through my work because I was using all Apple technology. And that was when I got my Apple Distinguished Educator. And that, again, linked me into a really useful network, a global network of leading educators using technology. And they're so useful having those places you can go to ask those questions. Sorry. So then what happened on top of that was the head of school said, well, actually, that's a brilliant idea. We need to get more talent into our teaching. Can you become the academic school lead for technology enhanced learning? I said, yes, of course I did, because I was really passionate about it. It was good for our learners, and I felt as if I could contribute. So I suppose that's when you start to move away from your kind of teaching and scholarship to a little bit now of influencing change and influencing practice of others, albeit kind of on a periphery. It was also at this time that I started dipping my toe, I guess, into research, but very much project-based research. And this is what I call my career 3A. I don't know how many, this is where we're at in my head. This is how my head works. But I'm starting to contribute knowledge in terms of scholarship as well. But again, as a cautionary note, I still feel as if the term research was still an alien space to me. So I wasn't thinking I was doing research. I was still thinking that I wasn't a researcher. And it's something that I still think that I'm not. So you can tell how much this kind of plays in my mind quite a lot. But what I did was I put in a grant application for JISC and Higher Education Academy to run an open education project at Leeds Metropolitan University. So that was an institution-wide project to deliver 300 hours of our learning in our organisation and present it out as open education resources. So to take 300 hours of our learning material and offer it free to the world under open license. So that project developed our open education resource repository at the time. We put all our materials in there and we got staff on board working with us to give away for free learning materials. This is like pre-MOOC stuff. So this was about giving just very granular pieces of work, short activities, a learning activity, and we categorized them by JAX codes, so they knew what subject they came from, categorized them by level, we categorized them by how many hours. And that was my first experience, I guess, of generating new knowledge, because through that activity, we learned so many things and we were able to share those learning experiences with other people. So again, I wouldn't say it was research, but it was generating new knowledge, which if you go by the definition we've had, it was doing a little bit of that. And some of that stuff was presented and published in various ways. One of the light bulb moments for me was, as part of this work, I developed a staff guide to open education resources, a very small booklet to help staff. And I developed it internally first, but then we released it as an open education resource under a Creative Commons license and made it available through that repository. And it was that light bulb moment when I used to go in and look at the statistics. Be downloaded 20,000 times. And then I found out it had been translated into 2 different languages, Spanish and French. And then it was also being used by universities in the Global South, in Africa. And I think what I realized is that you don't have to necessarily publish research to be doing good things and to be able to influence and demonstrate impact. The difficulty is much harder to trace it and to track it, because research is so locked into this idea of citation and to measurement, because that's effectively how you fund research and how you demonstrate impact. Whereas educational resources don't have that quite so much. But I did have a bit of a light bulb moment in terms of Creative Commons, because what it made me realise is that Creative Commons is a license where you can give your materials away for free to anybody in the world. And if they use them, they're legally obliged to cite you. They're legally obliged to say that you created it and to reference back to your original piece of work. And this, for me, was just like, I just can't tell you how much of this was a switch in my head saying, I don't need to be a researcher to have impact on learning and teaching. I don't need to be a researcher that's highly cited. Those things aren't important to me. I don't, you'll see, if you have a look at my research, you won't see me highly cited at the way up, because I don't publish in anything other than open journals, because I don't fundamentally believe in the model. And also, I'm fortunate that I've never been required to. So that's the other thing, is my job has never required me to demonstrate my impact in that way, but it has required me to demonstrate impact in other ways. So the Creative Commons license is my saviour when that emerged out of the open education work. That has been a saviour for me, because my work is out there in the world and people email me and say, oh, I just found a copy of this piece of work that you did in 2012. We've used it in a framework of ours at this university. Would you mind giving us a chat, talk about it? And you don't realise where your work is until somebody does that. So if you're using somebody's work that's Creative Commons license, please get in touch with them, because it's the most powerful thing that you can do is to tell someone that you're using their work in a meaningful way. So that then led into this idea of institutionally driving technology enhanced learn change. And then I was appointed as the institutional head of e-learning, which was an inaugural post, built up from many people's work, but obviously something that we wanted to drive forward. And through that process, we did a number of other projects in a similar way. Again, I would not term these as research because they're not like highly cited outputs, but they are outputs and they were published through a whole host of open routes. So we did one around exploring one-to-one tablet device use in higher education. That was funded through the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education. And during that, this is when I also fell in love with something else, which is called the TPAC framework. I can't imagine many people say they fall in love with frameworks, but I fell in love with the concept of the framework because what I was able to do was use this framework and it underpinned our strategy for technology enhanced learning activity at the university. So I think what frameworks are really good at is acting as a point of reference for everybody involved in something. Because otherwise, what my experience is, people just make their own assumptions around a lot of things. And a framework is where you can bring everybody on the same page and say, right, let's talk about this. We'll use this as our lens through which to talk about that activity. And the TPAC framework is, you'll see how it, from this point forward, really kind of merges into a lot of my work. Through then also I got a National Teaching Fellowship, not at the first time of asking. So if any of you are doing NTFs and you didn't get it first time, keep going, because actually sometimes it's about the year that you do it, the way that you do it, the things that you put in there. But again, another community of people that you can draw upon, that expertise to help you and guide you through the next steps. And this is where you really start to think as a person, I was going to say academic, but that's not necessarily true. As a person in higher education, where do you get your communities and where do you build your sense of belonging? And the National Teaching Fellowship really gave me a sense of belonging in that group. It wasn't heavily research driven. It was people really passionate about making teaching as good as it can be. And I don't like the term teaching excellence, by the way, because it's almost impossible for everybody to become an excellent teacher, but we can all enhance teaching. So I squirm at the word teaching excellence because nobody can describe what excellence is in teaching, but we're all capable of enhancing it. So I always use the word teaching enhancement. And then obviously somebody said, oh, you know what, you ought to do a PhD. I went, oh, yeah, I guess I should, feeling a bit of pressure. And that's when I started my PhD journey. So very late in my academic career, in fact, was the point at which I thought about taking that journey and starting it. And again, a couple of other projects that I was able to secure funding for, one through HEFKey. This is around developing a platform where students were bringing together their social media and their learning into one single place. I'm not going to spend too much time on these. And also then that feeding into work with groups like JISC. So a case study for JISC and their publication around next generation digital learning environments. So those are the kind of things that really interested me, doing practical things, learning things with teachers, learning things with students, telling our story and hoping that other people could take that and use it in a meaningful way. And then I suppose I had an opportunity that came to me, and then I took up a job in Liverpool as director of the Centre for Innovation in Education, which really brought together that wealth of experience that I built up over those last however many years and to that point. So Puyin, John, don't worry, I will finish in 5 minutes or so, okay? Even though you're worried that I'm only at 2018. But I think one of the things that, yeah, cake is essential, absolutely, CIE. So one of the things that I think, one of my legacies there is I was really passionate about making sure that we developed resources that weren't just available to staff at the University of Liverpool, but they were globally available. So we worked with the team and we developed a resource database, which is still there now, still growing. And the thing that I love about that is that we applied a Creative Commons license to all of those resources. So anybody in the world, and they do. So if you ask Dennis for the stats, all of the stats we get around where people are getting this stuff from is global now. And the important thing for me was to give people that weren't in academic roles an opportunity to have their work cited. So we applied Creative Commons license to everything so that if any of those resources are used, they should be cited back to the author. So here's an example from Tunde, who was also a member of the team. So John's got his stuff in there. So if you go in and search for John Brindle, you'll see the stuff that he produced is in that database and got a Creative Commons license, and people use it and they're citing these people. Yeah, it's not cited in terms of a metric that you can see in Google Scholar, but it is important and it references back the work of those individuals. Another big project we did, we worked with the British Council to support 6 universities in Peru to move entirely online during COVID. It gave me so many sleepless nights, I can't tell you that project because of the complexities of it, but the impact has been absolutely tremendous. We also produced online courses that they could use forever, and those courses still exist. So we've now got influence from that work into other countries to help them develop their online offer in the context of COVID. And obviously that brings me now to this idea of developing knowledge and understanding around hybridity and hybrid spaces, getting a sense of what that looks like in a post-COVID world. And this is where I, based on the work of TPAC and my PhD, which is directly linked to TPAC, developing a version of TPAC for a mixed modal environment post-COVID. And this is the work that I've done now around developing the SPAN framework, which is the subject, pedagogy and modality framework, which takes a lot of influence from TPAC. But my work around TPAC and using it with colleagues was that it wasn't working effectively in higher education and we needed a different approach. So the SPAN framework was born. And I guess this is where I started to become a researcher, which is my career for, when I started to contribute to knowledge in scholarship. So adding new knowledge, I was beginning to just about, after so many years, beginning to add new knowledge to the world as far as I could see. And this is where I completed my PhD, I guess, really, which was really deepening my understanding of research as an activity, but also making new knowledge available around TPAC when nobody had ever done that before. So my TPAC PhD was really around staff experience of it and using that framework. And then during that process, I loved this idea of understanding lived experiences collectively described through individual variation, which is what I love about phenomenography. But what I really also like to do was visualizing people's understanding and experiences. So my data was very visually orientated, as well as then moving into some qualitative data, which enriches that understanding as well. And then you'll be glad to know we're at 2022, and that's when I suppose got my Career 5 opportunity, which was to lead institutionally at Manchester a piece of work around flexible and blended learning. But I was very, very fortunate as well that Manchester had a very mature process for appointing professorships in teaching and scholarship. So I got my professorship through a teaching and scholarship track. And what was really interesting is that some of the post-92 universities that I still kept in touch with do not have very mature models for professorships around teaching and scholarship, but Manchester do. And I was very fortunate. So my application for professorship was through the teaching and scholarship route. And the work we're doing there is really about embedding flexibility at the heart of the university. And then obviously thinking about what research means around hybrid learning and the work we're doing now, which is this is a high flex space that I've got funding for, and we're now just going through a process of learning what students want around high flex, this ability to be able to choose whether to attend in person or online, and what that means for modality. And the kind of emerging things is that modality isn't just about learning, it's got a whole host of influences and things that people think about. You know, they choose modality because of an emotional consideration. They choose modality because of a well-being consideration, because of a participatory one, a socialized. So there's a whole host of reasons why students select certain modes, and it's very rarely just about the learning experience. So if they were choosing it predominantly for learning, they would nearly always come in and be in person, okay? Because that they do prefer that as a learning experience. But there's a whole host of other reasons why they choose other modes. So keep an eye out for some of that work. But just to finish, we talked about this teaching, research, scholarship nexus. But actually for me, they sometimes feel like labels of division. And universities have gone down this model of, are you a T only academic? Are you a T and S academic? Are you a T and R academic? Are you an R only academic? Are you an S only? I don't think there's any S onlys. But what we've done is categorize these groups. The reality is I do lean more towards scholarship, but I recognize that in all of our work, we're probably touching on all of them. I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to skip those because I just want to finish off with my career 6. I don't know what that looks like, but it's not necessarily that I've set out on a career, and often your career changes track. But I've often felt like a salmon swimming against the tide, against the stream, which can feel really tiring. I know many of you do this on a day-to-day basis. You're fighting battles to change things, be innovative and change practice, and it is tiring and exhausting. But you have to draw upon your communities to help you. It's too tiring to do it on your own. And that's why I think you have to find your communities and your people to work with. A number of who are in this room now, listening to me, I've worked with those people and drawn upon their knowledge and expertise to help my thinking, to help me drive forward change as well. And it's also important to celebrate wins, no matter how small they are, because it's very easy to get your energy sapped out of you. So those communities and getting with those people is where I'm re-energized, but also making sure you celebrate the wins of yourself and the wins of others too.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was really really interesting to hear some stuff I didn't know in there as well from having known you before, which was great. Does anyone have any questions for Simon that they'd like to ask? Usually I prepare a question while I'm listening, but I was too engrossed in what you were saying, Simon.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that, John, that you haven't managed to write a load of questions down. And I appreciate there's a lot to take in there, but I just really wanted to emphasize, you know, you see somebody but you don't understand the complexity of what's gone on how they've arrived there. And also for me, I don't position myself as a researcher, and I still don't feel very comfortable with that being a term that people use for me. So I find it quite challenging, as you can tell.
So my question is, looking forward then, next 5 years, where are you going to be? What are you going to be doing in 2030? Which sounds still really futuristic. Driving around like the Jetsons.
It does sound futuristic. I don't know. I think this is I've been quite fortunate that I've never set out a career journey, that I've had opportunities that have come across my desk, not ones that I've actively necessarily sought out. But I do think that is because I'm engaged in communities. So if you sit in isolation and you focus on your own work, doing your own thing, then I don't think those opportunities present themselves as often. And what I try to do is connect with those communities, one, because drawing upon them is so good for my own thinking, but also because then when somebody says something like, oh, we need somebody to help with this thing, they go, oh, Simon would be useful to connect into that, and you never know where that's going to end up. And that's really what's happened to me. Those things have ended up turning into jobs or job opportunities or career changes. So I will continue that most certainly. but I don't have any particular ambition to be anywhere other than where I am at the moment doing the things that I'm doing. But you never know, do you, where you're going to end up? That's the exciting bit, I guess.
That's great. Thank you.
It's really interesting. Denise has put, thanks for your interesting talk about the various careers you've gone on along your way. It's encouraging to learn that non-traditional routes are possible. So I think that's one of the things that I was going to kind of ask you about. So how does that, you have done a PhD, and it, like, what kind of value in terms of traditional route has that added to your journey, do you think, in terms of completing the PhD journey, where you've potentially had to be a researcher or a scholar, or I don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah, I think the concept of PhDs are interesting, because in some areas people associate having a PhD with being a good teacher, and I can categorically tell you that is not the case. So, and I'm willing to fight anybody that challenges me otherwise on that, because I was a good teacher before I had a PhD, and my students told me that, and my recognition tells me that. So if I'm going to blow my own trumpet, it's going to be that I feel as if I was a good teacher, and that's because I learned how to teach through engagement and active participation, and that doesn't come with a PhD. I totally get the value of PhDs. I've done one myself, and I absolutely get that having that opportunity to deeply understand a particular topic area and present that out in a meaningfully complex way, a complex way but accessible to others, is absolutely a skill set. But and that actually that is the way you become a good researcher. So I do think fundamentally there's a challenge in higher education where somebody spends 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years training to be a researcher, which is what you're really doing in a PhD. You're becoming a really solid researcher. Yet we don't afford the same level of time to train people to be effective teachers. So if you're lucky, you might get on a PG Cert or a PG Cap, and you'll have to quickly fly down a introduction to teaching in higher education in 1 year part-time. Good luck with that. But that, unfortunately, won't help you become an effective teacher. It will give you some skills that you can build upon. And I almost think we need something parallel that helps people that are in higher education, if they've got a T role, and that means T and R people as well, that if you're in a T and R role, you should probably spend as much time developing your teaching skills as you do your research skills, because it's half of your duty in many cases. I will also tell you categorically that I have seen data in a number of universities where, if you look at income generated for research very rarely pays for itself by the time you get there. And that's not to say it's not adding value, because it absolutely is, and we definitely should be doing it, and it's really important. But there is in some circles still that snobbery around the researcher and the teacher. Yet, if you look at the data and the income streams, go to your financial income around your university, and you will soon see where the money comes from to support the research that doesn't bring in enough money to cover itself. And it comes from teaching. And I think that's because research historically has had a kudos that's really high, and teaching is emerging as something that's really important. And I've been fortunate, I suppose, to ride that wave a little bit, where teaching is becoming more and more important in the context of higher education, and we're attributing more value to it, yet we still don't attribute enough staff development time to it. And I think that's one of our challenges as a sector, is how do we rebalance the time staff spend becoming good researchers, becoming good scholars, or becoming good teachers.
I think I remember conversations about that effect at Liverpool as well, about perhaps giving staff sabbatical time or time away from teaching and research to develop their curriculum, which would be the dream.
That's something that I've seen happen at a very local, granular level, but not an institutional wide, is teaching and learning sabbaticals where they focus on developing a really good curriculum. Go away for 6 months, come back, and your teaching and learning sabbatical is to redesign this program, more flexibly, more blended, whatever it might be, because that is time well spent.
Awesome. And I think, again, Danielle, as you said there, it is needed, especially with the tech and AI on the rise. We need to think more carefully about learning and teaching approaches. It just leaves me to say thank you so much, Simon, for your time and generosity and sharing your story with us.
No, thank you, everyone.